Okay, so have you ever been in that situation where, like, someone you love is really struggling? You can see they're headed down a rough path, maybe even battling addiction.
Oh, absolutely. It's heartbreaking to witness, that's for sure.
Totally. And you want to help, but you also don't want to push them away. It's like, how do you offer support without overstepping?
Yeah, it's a tough balance, for sure.
Hmm.
Finding that sweet spot between being there for them and respecting their autonomy is so tricky, especially when you're talking about addiction. It's complicated.
It really is. And that's what we're diving into today. Interventions.
Okay, interventions. I think a lot of people hear that word and they immediately picture those, like, dramatic confrontations they see on TV.
Oh, totally. Like the whole family gathered in the living room, tears, accusations flying.
Exactly. But our deep dive today is about the real deal, not the reality TV drama.
Right, we're going beyond those stereotypes because the source material really paints a different picture.
Totally. Like, for starters, interventions aren't just about substance abuse.
Really? I'll admit, that's what I always assumed.
Yeah, well, one expert we looked at talked about interventions being used for everything from gambling to eating disorders.
Hmm.
It's about addressing any kind of harmful pattern of behavior.
Oh, interesting. So it's more about recognizing a pattern that's hurting them and trying to interrupt it.
Exactly. And that's why the approach we're discussing is way more strategic than just, ambushing someone with a surprise therapy session.
Okay, that makes sense. So walk me through it. What are the key steps in planning an effective intervention?
Well, the first thing our sources really emphasize is research.
Research,
Right.
like about addiction in general.
That's part of it for sure. But it's also about understanding the potential treatment options out there. Like imagine coming to the table with, say, brochures for a 12-step program when the person really needs something totally different.
Right, you have to tailor the approach.
It's about showing you've done your homework, that your concern comes from a place of understanding, not just emotion.
Showing, not telling, with well-researched options in hand. Got it. What's next?
Okay, so once you've got that foundation, it's about assembling the right team. Because interventions are a group effort, right?
Makes sense. Strength in numbers and all that.
Exactly. You need a united front of people who genuinely care about this person and can handle a delicate situation with compassion. So, think close family members, friends, spouses, or partners, folks who have a genuine loving relationship with the person and can speak from the heart.
So it's not about who lives closest or who they see the most. It's about authentic connection.
You got it. And it's also really important to establish clear consequences.
Consequences, like an ultimatum.
Not exactly an ultimatum, it's more about setting firm boundaries. Because this isn't about enabling, it's about tough love. It's about letting the person know what will change in your relationship with them if they choose not to get help.
Okay, so it's about backing up your words with actions, showing them you're serious about supporting their recovery.
Right. And sometimes those consequences involve things like limiting contact or refusing to enable them financially. It's about setting healthy boundaries for yourself while encouraging them to seek help.
I can see how that would be so tough, but also crucial. You're showing them you're not giving up on them, but you're also not going to enable their destructive behavior.
Exactly. One expert in our research actually shared a really powerful story about a young man who'd been struggling with addiction for years. His family, they had tried everything, but it was the intervention, that moment when they laid out the consequences of his choices that finally got through to him.
Wow. So it was the turning point for him.
It was. He realized that they weren't giving up on him, but they couldn't keep enabling his destructive behavior. It was a real turning point in his recovery.
That's incredibly powerful. So we've got research, team building, and clear consequences. Anything else we should have on our intervention checklist?
Oh yeah, one more crucial thing, note-taking.
Note-taking during the intervention.
Yes, remember these conversations, they're emotionally charged and it's easy to get sidetracked or for things to escalate. Having notes helps keep the conversation on track.
So it's like having a roadmap, especially when emotions are running high, to make sure everyone feels heard and the conversation stays focused on the goal.
Exactly. You want to make sure that the gravity of the situation is respected and that everyone has a chance to express their concerns in a structured way.
That makes a lot of sense. So this direct approach, it's all about preparation, honesty, and a whole lot of love, but with clear boundaries.
You got it. It's about creating a space where tough conversations can happen, but within a framework of love and support.
That's really helpful to know. But our deep dive uncovered that this direct approach, it's not the only option, right? There are other types of interventions.
You're absolutely right. Sometimes a gentler approach is needed, especially if there have been past attempts at an intervention that maybe didn't go so well.
Oh, okay. So it's about finding the method that best fits the individual's situation and their history.
Exactly. And our sources actually discuss a few different options. We've got the direct approach that we just talked about, but there's also something called indirect intervention. And even in certain extreme cases, what's known as forcible intervention.
Okay, I'm really curious about those other options. Let's break them down a bit more. What does a direct intervention actually look like in action?
Okay, so picture this. Loved ones come together and they directly address the person who's struggling. They share specific examples of how the destructive behavior has affected them personally.
So it's not just saying, hey, we're worried about you. It's about sharing real stories, real consequences of their actions.
Exactly. And crucially, they also present a clear, prearranged treatment plan. No vague promises, just concrete next steps.
So it's like, here's what we found, here's what we think could help, and we're here to support you every step of the way.
Exactly. It's about providing a clear path forward.
But what happens if they still refuse help, even after hearing those personal stories and seeing the plan?
That's where those predetermined consequences that we talked about earlier come in. Because at that point, loved ones need to be prepared to follow through.
So if they said they'd limit contact, that means actually doing it, even though it's incredibly difficult.
It's about setting those firm boundaries. It's one of the hardest things for loved ones to do, but it's often a necessary step.
Wow, this is all a lot more strategic and nuanced than I initially thought. It's not just a dramatic confrontation, it's a carefully planned process with compassion at its core.
You got it. It's about approaching a challenging situation with both love and strategy.
Absolutely. But what about those other approaches you mentioned? The indirect and forcible interventions. Can you tell me a little more about those?
Right, so indirect intervention, it's a bit more, well, indirect, as the name suggests.
Okay, so less of a direct confrontation. What does it look like in practice?
It's more of an ongoing process, really. It involves things like expressing your concerns consistently, but without that big sit-down intervention-style meeting.
So more like planting seeds, having those conversations over time.
Exactly. And it's also about really focusing on setting and maintaining those healthy boundaries we talked about earlier.
Right, not enabling the harmful behavior, but also not shutting them out completely.
It's a delicate balance for sure.
Hmm.
But the key with indirect intervention is that it's an ongoing process. It's not a one-time thing.
So you're essentially choosing to engage differently with more intention, but without that formal intervention structure. That makes sense. But what about the other one you mentioned, forcible intervention? That sounds, well, intense.
Yeah, that one definitely falls into the last resort category. It's not something to be taken lightly at all.
So when would you even consider something like that?
It's usually reserved for situations where the person is a clear and present danger to themselves or others. Like if there's a serious risk of harm and all other attempts to encourage treatment have failed.
So it's not about forcing someone to change, but about preventing immediate harm.
Exactly. And even when forcible intervention is deemed necessary, the ultimate goal is still the same: to support the individual's journey towards recovery, just with added legal and medical oversight.
Okay, so it's a last resort, a way to intervene when someone's safety is at stake. It's heavy stuff. But let's shift gears back to the direct intervention approach for a moment. We talked about who should be on the intervention team, but what about bringing in a professional? Is there a role for a therapist in all of this?
You mean an interventionist?
Yeah, an interventionist. Are they like referees for family dysfunction? What exactly do they do?
You could say that. They're trained to facilitate these kinds of conversations, especially in emotionally charged situations like interventions. They bring a level of expertise in navigating these difficult conversations, understanding addiction, and de-escalating conflict.
So they're like the calm in the storm, helping everyone stay focused and communicate effectively, even when emotions are running high.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They can help keep things on track, make sure everyone feels heard, and help the family frame their concerns in a way that's more likely to resonate with the person they're trying to reach.
That makes a lot of sense. In what situations would having an interventionist be especially important?
But one situation where it's often recommended is when there are co-occurring mental health issues alongside the addiction. Because in those cases, you really need a professional who understands those complexities and can advocate for a more comprehensive treatment plan that addresses both.
Right, so it's not just addressing the addiction in isolation, but recognizing the bigger picture of their mental health.
Exactly. Another red flag is a history of unsuccessful rehab attempts. Because if someone's been to rehab multiple times and it hasn't stuck, an interventionist can help the family understand why those attempts might have failed and collaborate on a more tailored and effective approach.
That's so important, understanding the why behind those past struggles.
Absolutely. And of course, if there's any potential for violence or suicidal behavior, having a professional involved is crucial for everyone's safety.
Okay, that makes total sense. Safety first, always.
Yeah.
You've made it abundantly clear that careful planning is non-negotiable with interventions. But what happens if, even after all that effort, the person still says no, asking for a friend?
It's definitely a tough reality, and unfortunately, it's one that a lot of families face. But it's important to remember that even if the intervention doesn't result in immediate treatment, it can still plant seeds of change.
So it's not necessarily a failure, more like a step in the process.
Exactly. It might be the catalyst that encourages them to start reflecting on their choices, even if they're not ready to admit they need help right now.
So what happens next in those cases? What can loved ones do?
Well, this is where adjusting the strategy comes in. One option that our sources mention is transitioning to what's called an indirect intervention.
We talked about that a little bit earlier,
Yeah.
right? A gentler, ongoing approach.
Exactly. It focuses on setting those healthy boundaries, refusing to enable the harmful behavior, and consistently encouraging the person to seek help,
Mm.
but without that big formal intervention setting.
So it's about holding on to hope while also protecting your own well-being. Because you can't pour from an empty cup, right?
Exactly. You have to prioritize your own well-being while still being there for them in a healthy way. Let's say the intervention does work. The person agrees to get help. What are their options at that point?
That's the news we want to hear. Hit me with those treatment options. What's available?
Well, the good news is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, which is why that research phase that we talked about earlier is so important. Our sources highlight a range of options, from inpatient treatment, where the person lives at a facility 24/7, to outpatient programs, which offer more flexibility while still providing structured support.
So inpatient is like hitting the reset button in a controlled environment, while outpatient is about integrating treatment into daily life.
That's a great way to put it. And then there's also partial hospitalization, which is kind of a hybrid approach, where someone spends significant portion of the day at a facility, but then returns home at night.
Okay, so it's about finding the right level of care, the right balance of structure and support.
Exactly. And that's where the guidance of a qualified professional is essential. A good addiction specialist can assess the individual's needs, the severity of their situation, and any co-occurring mental health issues, and then recommend the most appropriate course of action.
They're the experts, after all. It's about finding the right fit for the individual. So we've got the levels of care figured out, but what about the actual treatment itself? Is it all support groups and tough love talks?
Not at all. There's actually a diverse range of therapeutic approaches, each tailored to address addiction from different angles. One approach that our sources highlight is medication-assisted therapy, or MMT.
I've heard of that for opioid addiction, but it can be used for other things too.
Absolutely. It combines medication with counseling and behavioral therapies, and it can be incredibly effective in managing cravings and withdrawal symptoms, which then allows individuals to focus on the underlying psychological and emotional aspects of their addiction.
So it's like creating a stable foundation so they can really do the work of recovery. What about those support groups you mentioned earlier? What role do they play in all of this?
Support groups are huge. They provide a sense of community, accountability, and encouragement, which are all essential for long-term recovery.
Right, because addiction can be so isolating. It's about more than just breaking the cycle of addiction. It's about building a new, healthier one.
That's exactly it. And that's an ongoing process that requires support, commitment, and a willingness to keep learning and growing. But before we move on, we should circle back to those alternative intervention approaches. We talked about forcible intervention earlier, and it's something that definitely raises a lot of questions.
For sure. It sounds like something most people hope to avoid. Can you elaborate on that a bit? You're telling me it sounds like, I don't know, a very last resort kind of thing.
It definitely is. Like we said, it's not something to be taken lightly at all.
Huh.
Basically, it involves legally compelling someone into treatment, often against their will.
Wow, so we're talking court orders and legal intervention here. When would that even be an option?
So it's typically reserved for situations where the person poses a clear and present danger to themselves or others, like when all other attempts to encourage treatment have failed.
So it's not about saying, hey, you need to get your act together. It's more about preventing potential harm, right?
Exactly. It's about ensuring everyone's safety in a really critical situation. And our sources were very clear that this is a complex process, ethically challenging for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's not a decision to be made lightly.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It requires really careful consideration and professional guidance. And even when it is deemed necessary, that ultimate goal is still the same: to support the individual on their journey to recovery, just with added legal and medical oversight.
It's a good reminder that while we aim for these interventions to be collaborative and compassionate, sometimes that extra level of intervention is needed to keep everyone safe. And we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. It's a lot to digest.
It really is. We're going from the nitty-gritty of planning and intervention to the different treatment approaches and everything in between. It's a lot.
It is, but the thing that really stands out to me and hopefully to our listeners is that while addiction is a serious issue, it's not insurmountable. There's hope, there's help available, and there's absolutely no shame in seeking it out, whether it's for yourself or for someone you care about.
I completely agree. And I think the biggest takeaway here is that you're not alone in this journey. Reach out to a therapist, a trusted healthcare provider, an addiction specialist, anyone who can provide guidance and support, because there are people out there who are equipped to help navigate this really challenging terrain.
They're the experts, after all. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of interventions. Until next time, everyone, stay curious, keep learning, and remember, there's always more to discover.